Welcome back to the Sleepy Mind channel. Tonight we explore moss, following water movement, energy capture, and slow biological growth as they unfold over long periods of time and shape the system in steady, observable ways. If you find these long, calm science documentaries useful, you can like the video and subscribe for more. If you choose to leave a comment about where you are listening from, it is always interesting to see how far these stories travel. Let us begin. Moss is already present here, close to the surface, resting against stone, soil, and wood. It is not a single organism, but a large group of small plants, known as bryophytes, with more than 12,000 described species worldwide. They do not form flowers, seeds, or true roots. Instead, they persist through direct contact with their surroundings, exchanging water and dissolved nutrients across the surface of their leaves and stems. This way of living is ancient. Fossil and molecular evidence suggests that plants similar to modern mosses were among the first to spread across land more than 400 million years ago. At that time, soil as it exists today was thin or absent. Moss-like plants help stabilize loose mineral surfaces, slowing erosion and allowing organic material to accumulate. Over long spans of time, this gradual process contributed to the formation of the first terrestrial soils. The physical structure of moss is simple and efficient. Thin leaves, often only one cell thick, maximize surface area. Water moves into the plant by capillary action, drawn upward and outward through narrow spaces between cells, much like liquid rising through a sponge. Because there is no internal plumbing system, the entire plant responds quickly to moisture in the air and on the ground. When conditions dry, metabolic activity slows. When water returns, photosynthesis resumes within minutes. Moss is distributed across nearly every continent. It grows in forests, tundra, wetlands, and urban environments, from sea level to high elevations. Some species live only a few years, while others form colonies that persist for decades, slowly expanding outward at a rate of just a few millimeters per year. In peat-forming mosses, such as sphagnum, layers of dead plant material accumulate beneath living growth, storing carbon over thousands of years and influencing the chemistry of entire landscapes. Seen at this scale, moss is not background decoration. It is a quiet framework that connects rock, water, air, and time, maintaining continuity across environments that change far more quickly than it does. Moss can be understood by what it does not have, as much as by what it does. There are no true roots extending into the ground. Instead, fine thread-like structures called rhizoids anchor the plant to a surface. These structures provide stability rather than nourishment. Water and dissolved minerals are absorbed directly through the leaves and stems, moving inward wherever contact is made. This creates a system that is closely tied to rainfall, humidity, and surface moisture, responding almost immediately to changes in its surroundings. The absence of vascular tissue shapes everything about how moss grows. There are no internal tubes to move water upward against gravity, as seen in trees and flowering plants. Because of this, moss remains low to the ground, spreading outward rather than upward. Height is limited, but surface coverage is not. Over time, many small plants grow together, forming continuous mats that trap moisture and buffer temperature at the ground level. This growth pattern reflects its early place in plant evolution. When plants first moved from water to land, the challenge was not height or competition for light, but survival on an exposed surface. Moss-like ancestors tolerated drying, ultraviolet radiation, and fluctuating temperatures by slowing their internal processes. When water was absent, cells entered a state of dormancy. When moisture returned, cellular membranes rehydrated and photosynthesis resumed. This ability, known as poikilohydry, is still present in modern mosses and explains how they persist in environments where conditions change rapidly. Energy capture in moss follows the same basic chemical pathway used by all green plants. Carbon dioxide enters the leaves from the surrounding air. Light energy drives the conversion of carbon dioxide and water into sugars within chloroplasts. Because the leaves are only one cell thick, there is little distance for gases and light to travel. This allows photosynthesis to begin quickly when conditions are suitable, even after extended dry periods. As moss spreads across a surface, it alters that surface. Fine particles of dust and mineral debris become trapped between stems. Organic matter from dead cells accumulates slowly beneath living growth. Microorganisms establish themselves within this sheltered layer, breaking down material and releasing nutrients. Over years and decades, what began as bare stone or compacted soil becomes more stable and biologically active. These changes are subtle but cumulative. On forest floors, moss helps regulate moisture by slowing evaporation. In shaded environments, it moderates temperature swings at the soil surface. On rocks, it creates microfractures by holding water against mineral surfaces, contributing to gradual weathering. None of these processes are fast, but they are continuous. Time operates differently at this scale. Individual shoots may live only a short while, but the colony persists through constant replacement. Growth proceeds millimeter by millimeter, season after season. In long-lived systems, particularly in northern peatlands, layers of moss accumulate faster than they decompose. Oxygen becomes limited beneath the surface, slowing microbial activity. Carbon fixed from the atmosphere remains stored in these layers for centuries or longer, linking the quiet growth of moss to global cycles of carbon and climate. Through this steady interaction with water, light, and surface materials, moss maintains a presence that is both fragile and persistent, shaped by conditions, yet capable of shaping them in return. Moss appears wherever surfaces remain undisturbed, long enough for slow accumulation to matter. In forests, it settles along the bases of trees, across decaying wood, and over compacted soil, where light arrives indirectly through the canopy. The water that sustains it often arrives gradually, as mist, dew, or light rain filtered through leaves above. Because moss holds moisture close to the surface, evaporation is reduced, and the ground beneath remains damp for longer periods than exposed soil nearby. On stone, moss establishes itself in shallow depressions and microscopic cracks. Water collects in these spaces after rainfall, carrying dissolved minerals released by the rock itself. As moss absorbs this water, weak organic acids produced during normal metabolic processes interact with the mineral surface. Over long spans of time, this interaction contributes to physical and chemical weathering, expanding the spaces where moisture can settle again. The process reinforces itself, allowing moss to remain where little else can persist. In cooler regions, moss becomes a dominant ground cover. In boreal forests and tundra, low temperatures slow decomposition. Moss growth, though slow, can exceed the rate at which dead material breaks down. As each generation grows atop the last, layers accumulate. In some regions, these layers reach several meters in depth, forming peat. Radiocarbon measurements show that the deepest layers can be thousands of years old, preserving a record of past climates, vegetation, and atmospheric composition. Even where conditions seem dry, moss endures by adjusting its internal state. When moisture is unavailable, cells lose water and metabolic reactions nearly stop. Proteins and membranes remain intact, protected by sugars and structural changes within the cell. This state can last for months. When water returns, cellular processes restart without the need for repair or regeneration. Photosynthesis resumes, and growth continues as though the pause had been brief. This capacity allows moss to occupy a wide geographic range. It grows near coastlines where salt spray occasionally reaches inland surfaces. It appears at high elevations where freezing temperatures limit other plants. It persists in urban environments on shaded walls, pavement edges and rooftops, where rainwater briefly collects before draining away. In each case, the same basic exchange occurs between surface, water, and light. As moss spreads, it creates habitat for organisms much smaller than itself. Tiny invertebrates move through the spaces between stems, feeding on microorganisms and organic debris. Bacteria and fungi form stable communities within the moist interior of the mat. These organisms contribute to nutrient cycling at a scale measured in millimeters, yet integrated across entire landscapes. Across years and decades, the presence of moss influences how water moves across the ground. Rainfall is absorbed and released slowly, reducing rapid runoff. Soil beneath remains cooler in summer and less prone to freezing in winter. These effects are not dramatic at any single moment, but they persist through repeated cycles, shaping conditions for other forms of life. In this way, moss participates quietly in systems far larger than itself. It connects the chemistry of rock to the biology of soil, the movement of water to the storage of carbon, and the passage of seasons to spans of time measured in centuries. Moss exists within a rhythm that unfolds slowly. Individual shoots complete their life cycles over periods ranging from a single growing season to several years, depending on species and conditions. Growth occurs primarily at the tips, where new cells are formed through division. Older cells remain in place, contributing to structure and water retention even after they stop growing. This layered pattern allows the colony to persist even as individual components are replaced. Reproduction does not rely on seeds. Instead, moss produces microscopic spores within small capsules that rise just above the leafy surface. When conditions are dry enough, the capsules open and release spores into moving air. Each spore carries a complete genetic blueprint, yet its success depends on landing in a location where moisture is reliable. Only a small fraction will establish new growth, but the process repeats continuously, maintaining populations across wide areas. From a global perspective, moss is one of the most widely distributed plant groups on Earth. It is found on every continent, including Antarctica, where it survives in narrow bands along the coast. In tropical regions, it grows high in forest canopies, intercepting moisture from clouds before rain reaches the ground. In temperate zones, it carpets shaded soil and stone. This distribution reflects flexibility rather than speed. Moss does not outcompete larger plants through height or rapid growth, but through persistence and tolerance. Timescales extend further in peat-forming systems. In wetlands dominated by sphagnum moss, living growth forms a surface layer, while older material is buried beneath. Oxygen levels decrease with depth, slowing decomposition. As a result, carbon fixed from the atmosphere during photosynthesis remains stored rather than released. Measurements of peat accumulation show average rates of less than 1 millimeter per year, yet over thousands of years, this leads to deposits several meters thick. These deposits influence local hydrology by retaining water and altering acidity, shaping entire ecosystems. At this scale, moss acts as both a participant and a record keeper. Pollen grains, dust particles, and airborne compounds become trapped within accumulating layers. Scientists analyze these layers to reconstruct past environments, identifying shifts in vegetation, temperature, and atmospheric composition over long periods. The structure of moss allows this information to be preserved with minimal disturbance. Despite this long continuity, moss remains closely tied to immediate conditions. Light availability influences growth form, with more compact shapes developing in exposed areas and looser forms in shade. Moisture levels determine metabolic activity on a daily basis. Temperature affects the rate of chemical reactions within cells, slowing processes in cold conditions without causing damage. Each response is reversible, allowing the plant to adjust repeatedly without long-term stress. Across landscapes, these small responses combine into stable patterns. Moss moderates water flow, contributes to soil development, and supports communities of microorganisms and invertebrates. Its presence smooths transitions between rock, soil, and vegetation, maintaining continuity where larger plants arrive later or not at all. Through its slow expansion and long persistence, moss demonstrates how biological systems can influence their environment without rapid change or visible movement. Its impact emerges through accumulation, repetition, and time. Moss interacts with its surroundings through constant exchange rather than force. Water arriving at the surface is absorbed, held briefly, and released slowly. This alters how moisture moves across the ground, reducing sharp changes between wet and dry conditions. In shaded forests, this buffering effect maintains a more stable microclimate at the soil surface, where temperature and humidity fluctuate less than in exposed areas. Within this thin boundary layer, energy moves quietly. Light filtered through leaves above reaches the moss at lower intensity. Photosynthesis proceeds at a measured pace, converting carbon dioxide and water into sugars that support slow growth. Because metabolic rates remain low, nutrient demand is modest. This allows moss to persist where soils are thin and mineral availability is limited. As organic material accumulates beneath living growth, chemical conditions shift. In peat-forming mosses, the exchange of ions between plant cells and surrounding water increases acidity. This reduces the activity of decomposer organisms, slowing the breakdown of dead material. The result is gradual accumulation rather than loss. Over time, this changes the physical structure of the ground, increasing water retention and altering plant communities that establish later. Living organisms within moss operate at small scales. Microscopic animals move through films of water between leaves, feeding on bacteria and algae. Their movement redistributes nutrients locally. Fungi form associations with moss tissues, contributing to nutrient exchange and structural stability. These interactions occur continuously, independent of larger seasonal cycles. Seasonal change still shapes activity. In cooler months, metabolic processes slow as temperatures drop and light levels decrease. In warmer periods, growth resumes where moisture is sufficient. The transition is gradual rather than abrupt. Moss does not shed leaves or enter a defined dormant phase. Instead, activity increases and decreases in response to immediate conditions, allowing continuity through changing seasons. Across longer spans of time, these steady processes influence landscape development. Areas where moss establishes early tend to retain moisture longer, supporting later plant growth. In wetlands, peat accumulation alters water flow patterns, redirecting streams and shaping basins. In forests, moss contributes to soil formation that supports trees whose lifespans are measured in centuries. The scale of change remains quiet and distributed. No single moment defines the impact. Instead, repeated interactions between water, light, and surface material accumulate into lasting structure. Moss persists through this repetition, maintaining its role without expansion beyond its limits. In this way, moss remains present through environmental shifts that exceed the lifespan of individual plants. Its form and function remain consistent even as surrounding systems evolve. What changes is not the nature of moss itself, but the context in which it continues to grow. Moss remains even as conditions around it shift gradually. Light levels change as tree canopies grow or thin. Moisture patterns adjust with rainfall cycles and seasonal movement. Moss responds without reorganization or structural change. Its growth rate adjusts, but its form remains consistent, maintaining contact with the surface that supports it. Over extended periods, this continuity becomes significant. In forests, moss contributes to the slow accumulation of organic material that supports soil organisms and plant roots. In wetlands, it shapes the movement and storage of water across wide areas. These processes operate at a pace that is often unnoticed, yet their effects persist long after individual weather events have passed. The chemical environment within moss is stable but active. Cells regulate internal water content and ion balance through passive processes, relying on diffusion rather than transport systems. This simplicity reduces energy demand and allows survival during periods when resources are limited. When favorable conditions return, normal activity resumes without delay. Across landscapes, moss forms connections between physical and biological systems. It links atmospheric moisture to groundwater movement. It connects mineral surfaces to organic processes. It provides continuity between bare substrate and more complex vegetation. These connections are maintained through repeated cycles rather than growth spurts or expansion. In regions where moss dominates ground cover, its presence influences the distribution of other organisms. Seedlings of larger plants encounter a surface that retains moisture and moderates temperature. Microorganisms find stable conditions for growth and interaction. Invertebrates move through the spaces within the moss mat, contributing to nutrient redistribution at small scales. Time continues to shape these interactions. Short-term changes in weather alter activity from day to day. Seasonal patterns influence growth over months. Long-term shifts in climate and landscape unfold over centuries. Moss persists through all of these scales, adjusting activity rather than structure. This persistence does not depend on resistance, but on flexibility. By tolerating wide variation in water availability and temperature, moss avoids damage during unfavorable periods. By resuming activity quickly when conditions improve, It maintains continuity without requiring repair or replacement. As a result, moss remains a constant presence across environments that are otherwise dynamic. Its influence accumulates through duration rather than intensity. The surface it occupies becomes gradually shaped by this ongoing interaction, creating conditions that support broader ecological processes over time. Moss also reflects changes that occur beyond the scale of individual landscapes. Atmospheric composition influences the rate at which carbon is absorbed during photosynthesis. Precipitation patterns determine how often metabolic activity resumes after drying. Temperature affects the speed of chemical reactions inside cells. Each factor alters behavior slightly, yet none disrupts the underlying system. In long-lived moss-dominated environments, particularly peatlands, these small responses accumulate into measurable effects. Water held within moss layers slows drainage, keeping ground conditions saturated for extended periods. This limits oxygen availability below the surface, reducing microbial decomposition. As a result, organic carbon remains stored rather than returning quickly to the atmosphere. Estimates suggest that peatlands occupy a small fraction of Earth's land surface, yet store more carbon than all forest vegetation combined. This storage is not static. Carbon enters through photosynthesis at the surface and moves downward as older material is buried. Chemical conditions change with depth, influencing how nutrients and gases move through the system. Methane and carbon dioxide form at different layers, depending on oxygen availability. These gases move slowly upward, regulated by water content and temperature. The system remains balanced through gradual exchange rather than rapid release. Outside peatlands, moss contributes to similar but smaller scale processes. On forest floors, it influences soil respiration by moderating moisture and temperature. On exposed rock, it participates in the slow conversion of mineral surfaces into biologically active substrates. In urban settings, it absorbs water from rainfall, reducing surface runoff and retaining moisture in places where soil is limited. Observation of moss over time reveals patterns that repeat across regions. Growth increases during periods of consistent moisture. Activity slows during extended dry or cold intervals. Recovery follows quickly when conditions shift. These responses occur without visible change in structure, giving the impression of stillness even while internal processes continue. The continuity of moss presence allows it to serve as a reference point within changing environments. Where larger plants respond to disturbance by growth or decline, moss maintains its position. Its surface records subtle variations in deposition, moisture, and exposure. Over long periods, this record becomes layered within accumulated material, preserving information about past conditions. Through these interactions, moss remains integrated within systems that extend far beyond its physical size. It participates in energy flow, water movement, and chemical cycling, not through dominance, but through persistence. Its role is defined by duration rather than scale. Moss responds to its environment without storing energy for rapid change. There are no reserves for sudden growth or expansion. Instead, energy captured through photosynthesis is used to maintain structure and replace cells gradually. This limits how quickly the plant can respond to favorable conditions, but it also prevents overextension when conditions become less reliable. Water movement remains central to this balance. Thin films of moisture form between leaves during periods of humidity or light rainfall. These films allow dissolved gases and nutrients to move freely into cells. When the films disappear, movement slows, and internal processes reduce accordingly. This direct coupling between water availability and activity ensures that moss operates only within the limits set by its surroundings. At small scales, this creates stability. Moss mats dampen fluctuations in surface temperature by holding moisture and shading the ground. During warmer periods, evaporation from the surface absorbs heat. During cooler periods, retained water reduces rapid heat loss. These effects are modest but consistent, shaping conditions for organisms living within and beneath the moss. Across broader areas, repeated interactions produce uniform patterns. In forests, moss cover is often greatest, where light and moisture remain moderate. In open areas, it persists in depressions and shaded edges. These distributions reflect the balance between exposure and protection rather than competition or exclusion. Over decades, the slow accumulation of organic material beneath moss contributes to soil horizons that differ from those formed under grasses or shrubs. Nutrient availability develops gradually. Nitrogen enters through deposition and microbial activity. Phosphorus and other minerals arrive through weathering of underlying material. Moss does not actively transport these nutrients, but it influences where they remain available by moderating water flow and retention. These processes integrate moss into nutrient cycles without direct control. It does not regulate uptake or release. Instead, it creates conditions that favor gradual exchange. This passive role allows moss to persist in environments where active regulation would require more energy than is available. As environmental conditions shift over long periods, moss remains aligned with the slowest processes. Geological change alters surface materials over millennia. Climate patterns adjust over centuries. Biological communities change over decades. Moss remains through each scale, adjusting activity while maintaining form. This persistence allows continuity in systems where other components change. It does not lead transitions or respond rapidly. It remains in place, absorbing water, capturing light, and interacting with surface materials in the same manner across repeated cycles. Moss also interacts with air in ways that are easily overlooked. Because its tissues are thin and exposed, gases move directly between cells and the surrounding atmosphere. Carbon dioxide enters during photosynthesis, while oxygen produced within cells diffuses outward. This exchange occurs whenever moisture allows metabolic activity, linking moss closely to local atmospheric conditions. Particles carried by air settle onto the moss surface. Dust, pollen, and fine organic material become trapped among leaves and stems. Some of this material dissolves into surface water and becomes available to microorganisms living within the moss mat. Over time, repeated deposition contributes to the gradual enrichment of the surface layer, even in locations far from soil or nutrient sources. In regions influenced by regular mist or cloud cover, moss plays a role in intercepting water before it reaches the ground. Thin droplets condense on exposed surfaces and are absorbed directly. This process increases total water input to the system beyond what is measured as rainfall alone. In cloud forests, this contribution can represent a significant portion of annual moisture, supporting plant communities that rely on consistent hydration. The relationship between moss and larger plants remains indirect. Moss does not compete strongly for light or nutrients. Instead, it occupies spaces that remain beneath or between other forms of vegetation. Its presence can influence where seeds germinate by maintaining surface moisture and reducing temperature extremes. Some seedlings establish successfully within moss mats, while others fail due to limited contact with mineral soil. These outcomes vary by species and conditions, creating patterns that shift slowly over time. Disturbance affects moss differently than larger plants. Physical disruption removes surface layers but does not alter underlying conditions. Where surfaces remain stable after disturbance, moss can re-establish through spore deposition or vegetative fragments. Because growth is slow, recovery unfolds gradually, yet persistence remains likely if moisture and shade return. Across repeated cycles of change, moss maintains its role without modification. It does not adapt through rapid structural change or expansion. Instead, it continues to operate within the same limits, allowing external conditions to determine the pace of activity. This creates a form of resilience based on tolerance rather than resistance. Through this steady presence, moss contributes to the continuity of surface processes across time. It connects atmosphere to ground, water to mineral surfaces, and biological activity to long-term environmental change. These connections remain subtle, but they persist through repeated cycles, shaping conditions in ways that become visible only when observed over extended periods. Moss remains closely tied to the movement of water across landscapes. When rain falls, much of it is absorbed directly into the moss layer before reaching the soil below. This slows the downward movement of water, spreading it laterally and extending the time it remains near the surface. In areas with frequent rainfall, this effect contributes to consistently moist ground conditions, even between precipitation events. As water moves through the moss mat, dissolved substances travel with it. Minerals released from rock surfaces, nutrients deposited from the air, and organic compounds produced by microorganisms all circulate within this thin layer. Exchange occurs through diffusion rather than directed flow. This creates a chemically mixed environment where resources are shared gradually rather than concentrated impulses. Temperature interacts with these processes continuously. Moss surfaces warm and cool more slowly than bare ground due to the presence of retained water. During warmer periods, evaporation moderates surface temperature. During cooler periods, stored moisture reduces rapid cooling. These effects stabilize conditions for organisms that depend on narrow temperature ranges. The physical form of moss adjusts subtly in response to exposure. In more open areas, growth remains compact, reducing surface area and limiting water loss. In shaded environments, stems elongate slightly, increasing contact with available light. These differences arise from changes in cell division rates rather than structural redesign. The underlying form remains the same. Over long periods, moss contributes to the development of layered ground surfaces. Each generation grows atop the remnants of the last, creating stratified material that reflects past conditions. Variations in color, density, and composition correspond to shifts in moisture, temperature, and atmospheric inputs. These layers form slowly, but once established, they remain relatively undisturbed. In some regions, these accumulations influence hydrological pathways. Water moves laterally through moss layers rather than vertically through soil, altering drainage patterns. Small streams may shift course. pools may form where water movement is slowed. These changes occur gradually, without sudden transition. Moss does not act independently in these systems. Its effects emerge through interaction with climate, topography, and surrounding vegetation. It responds to these factors while simultaneously influencing how they operate at the surface level. This reciprocal relationship remains stable because moss activity scales directly with environmental conditions. Across extended spans of time, these interactions integrate moss into broader environmental systems. It remains present through cycles of wet and dry, warm and cool, maintaining its function without interruption. The system it supports continues to evolve, shaped by steady exchange rather than abrupt change. Moss also reflects the passage of time through its patterns of accumulation and renewal. New growth appears at the surface where light and moisture are available. Older material beneath becomes compressed, altered by chemical exchange and microbial activity. This vertical arrangement forms a slow-moving record, with each layer corresponding to conditions present during its formation. Within this layered structure, chemical gradients develop. Oxygen is abundant near the surface, supporting aerobic microorganisms. Deeper layers become progressively lower in oxygen as water fills pore spaces. This shift influences which organisms remain active and how organic material is processed. The result is a gradual transition rather than a sharp boundary, allowing continuity across depths. These conditions affect how nutrients move through the system. Nitrogen enters primarily through atmospheric deposition and microbial fixation. Phosphorus arrives through mineral weathering and dust. Moss influences how long these nutrients remain available by moderating water flow and microbial activity. Release and uptake occur slowly, reducing loss through rapid leaching. Across different regions, similar processes unfold at different rates. In cooler climates, low temperatures slow decomposition further, allowing thicker accumulations to develop. In warmer climates, faster microbial activity limits depth, but maintains continuous turnover. In each case, moss adjusts its activity to local conditions without altering its fundamental structure. The interaction between moss and surrounding vegetation remains indirect but persistent. Larger plants alter light and moisture patterns, which in turn influence moss growth. Moss affects soil development, which influences where other plants establish. This feedback operates over decades, shaping community structure through gradual adjustment rather than competition. Observation over long periods reveals that moss does not expand continuously. Instead, it maintains boundaries defined by moisture, light, and surface stability. Where these factors remain within tolerable ranges, moss persists. Where they shift beyond limits, activity slows or stops, leaving the surface available for other organisms. This response remains reversible if conditions return. Through these repeated interactions, moss contributes to landscape continuity. It bridges intervals between disturbance and recovery, maintaining surface stability while other components change. Its influence is not marked by growth spurts or decline, but by sustained presence. In this steady role, moss integrates physical, chemical, and biological processes across time. It remains active without acceleration, responsive without transformation, and persistent without expansion. The systems it supports continue to develop around it, shaped by the same slow movement that defines its own growth. Moss exists within environmental systems that change gradually rather than abruptly. Shifts in rainfall patterns alter how often surfaces remain moist. Changes in temperature influence the length of active periods during the year. Moss responds by adjusting metabolic pace rather than altering structure. Activity increases when conditions allow and decreases when they do not, maintaining continuity without interruption. In areas where moisture remains reliable, moss growth proceeds steadily. New tissue forms at the surface, while older material becomes incorporated into the layer beneath. This slow turnover maintains thickness and coverage over long periods. Where moisture becomes less consistent, growth slows, but existing structure remains intact, ready to resume activity when water returns. The relationship between moss and microorganisms remains central to these systems. Bacteria and fungi occupy spaces within the moss mat, processing organic material and contributing to nutrient availability. Their activity depends on moisture and temperature, mirroring the conditions that govern moss itself. Together, these organisms form a stable community that persists through repeated environmental cycles. Chemical exchange continues throughout this system. Ions move between water, plant tissue, and underlying material through diffusion. This movement regulates acidity, nutrient availability, and microbial activity. In peat-forming environments, the balance between production and decomposition shifts toward accumulation. In other settings, turnover remains balanced, maintaining steady-state conditions. Over long spans of time, these processes influence landscape features. Soil depth increases gradually beneath persistent moss cover. Water retention alters drainage patterns. Surface stability improves, reducing erosion on gentle slopes. These changes occur without visible markers, becoming apparent only when compared across decades. Moss does not initiate these transformations alone. Climate, topography, and surrounding vegetation provide the framework within which it operates. Moss responds to this framework while contributing to its modification at the surface level. This reciprocal interaction remains stable because it unfolds slowly and continuously. Across different environments, the same principles apply. Where moisture, light, and surface stability align, moss maintains its presence. Where they shift, activity adjusts. This consistency allows moss to function as a steady component within systems that are otherwise dynamic. Through its ongoing interaction with water, light, and surface materials, moss remains integrated within environmental processes that extend beyond its physical scale. Its influence accumulates through duration rather than intensity, shaping conditions quietly over time. Moss operate within narrow physical limits that define its role across environments. Light reaches the surface at reduced intensity after passing through vegetation or cloud cover. Water arrives intermittently, often as fine droplets rather than sustained flow. Temperature fluctuates daily and seasonally. Moss responds to each factor through direct exchange rather than internal regulation. This mode of interaction keeps activity closely aligned with external conditions. When moisture is present, photosynthesis proceeds and sugars are produced. When moisture is absent, chemical reactions slow without causing damage. This coupling prevents excess growth during favorable periods and reduces stress during unfavorable ones. The result is stability maintained through restraint rather than control. Across surfaces, moss influences how energy is absorbed and released. Darker tissues absorb solar radiation, while retained water moderates heating through evaporation. These effects reduce temperature extremes at the ground level. Organisms living within or beneath the moss experience a more consistent environment than those exposed directly to air and sunlight. Material movement through moss remains slow and continuous. Nutrients arrive through atmospheric deposition, mineral weathering, and microbial activity. Loss occurs through gradual leaching and uptake by surrounding organisms. Because water movement is moderated, nutrients remain available locally rather than being rapidly transported away. This supports sustained biological activity at small scales. Over time, these processes contribute to surface stability. Moss binds loose particles together through physical entanglement and moisture retention. On slopes, this reduces movement during rainfall. On flat surfaces, it limits dust displacement and surface cracking. These effects accumulate incrementally, reinforcing conditions that support continued moss presence. The persistence of moss does not rely on adaptation through change, but on tolerance through consistency. Its structure remains largely unchanged across environments, while activity varies in response to conditions. This allows it to occupy spaces that experience frequent variation without requiring recovery or repair. As surrounding systems evolve, moss remains present at the interface between air, water, and solid surface. It does not dominate or retreat rapidly. Instead, it maintains position through repeated cycles, contributing to continuity across time. Moss remains part of landscapes where movement is subtle and change is measured. Wind passes over its surface without resistance. Rain settles into it rather than running off immediately. Light reaches it indirectly, filtered and softened by surrounding structures. These conditions define the pace at which processes unfold. At the cellular level, this pace is reflected in metabolism. Enzymatic reactions proceed slowly, limited by temperature and water availability. Sugars produced through photosynthesis are used locally, supporting maintenance rather than storage. Cells divide at a measured rate, extending growth incrementally rather than rapidly. This keeps the system balanced with its environment. The relationship between moss and water continues to shape its influence. During periods of frequent moisture, the moss mat remains active for longer stretches, allowing steady carbon fixation. During drier intervals, activity contracts to brief windows when humidity rises. This pattern repeats across days and seasons, producing consistent outcomes over long periods. In environments where moss cover is extensive, these small interactions scale upward. Moisture retained at the surface reduces variability in soil conditions below. Temperature moderation influences microbial processes. Nutrient availability remains relatively stable. Together, these effects support broader ecological continuity without requiring active regulation. Moss also affects how surfaces age. By holding water against rock and soil, it promotes slow chemical reactions that alter mineral composition. These reactions proceed over decades and centuries, contributing to the gradual transformation of landscapes. Moss does not accelerate these processes dramatically, but it maintains the conditions under which they occur. Across regions, this role remains consistent. Whether on forest floors, stone walls, or open ground, moss operates within the same limits. Its form remains familiar. Its function remains steady. Only the surrounding context changes. This consistency allows moss to remain integrated within systems that undergo larger transformations. Forests grow and thin. Wetlands expand and contract. Climate patterns shift. Moss persists through each phase, adjusting activity while maintaining structure. Through this steady presence, moss continues to link immediate conditions to long-term outcomes. Its influence is distributed across time rather than concentrated in moments. The surfaces it occupies reflect this continuity, shaped gradually by the same processes repeated again and again. Moss remains responsive to small variations that occur within otherwise stable environments. A brief increase in humidity can activate metabolic processes even without rainfall. A short period of sunlight can support photosynthesis through thin cloud cover. These narrow windows of activity accumulate over time, allowing growth to proceed without dependence on extended favorable conditions. The structure of moss supports this responsiveness. Cells are arranged in simple layers with minimal separation between internal processes and the external environment. Water enters and leaves freely. Gases diffuse without resistance. This openness reduces the energy required to maintain internal balance, allowing activity to resume quickly whenever conditions permit. Across seasons, these responses follow predictable patterns. In wetter months, periods of activity lengthen. In drier months, activity becomes intermittent. The overall form remains unchanged. Moss does not prepare for future conditions or respond to past ones. It operates continuously within the present state of its surroundings. In regions with long winters, moss activity slows, but does not cease entirely. Snow cover insulates the surface, maintaining temperatures close to freezing rather than allowing deeper cold. Beneath this layer, moss remains hydrated, and low levels of metabolic activity continue. When snow melts, full activity resumes without delay. These dynamics influence the timing of biological processes in surrounding systems. Soil organisms respond to moderated temperature and moisture conditions. Nutrient cycling proceeds more evenly across the year. Larger plants benefit indirectly from stable ground conditions during critical periods of growth. Moss also contributes to the visual continuity of landscapes. Its persistent presence softens transitions between seasons, maintaining surface coverage when other plants lose leaves or enter dormancy. This continuity reflects underlying stability rather than aesthetic design. Over long periods, the same processes repeat. Activity rises and falls. Growth continues incrementally. Material accumulates slowly. No single cycle defines the system. Instead, outcomes emerge through repetition across timescales that exceed individual lifespans. This pattern allows moss to remain integrated within environments that change gradually. It does not respond with acceleration or decline. It remains present, operating at the same pace as the slowest processes around it. Moss shapes the surfaces it occupies through accumulation rather than expansion. Each cycle of growth adds a thin layer of living tissue at the surface, while older material is gradually compressed below. Chemical exchange alters this older material, changing its structure and composition over time. The process is slow, but it is continuous. Within these layers, water movement remains controlled. Pore spaces retain moisture and limit rapid drainage. This prolongs contact between water and organic material, supporting gradual chemical reactions. Nutrients released through decomposition remain nearby, available for reuse rather than being carried away. This local retention reinforces stability at the surface. The interaction between moss and light remains indirect. Sunlight reaching the surface is filtered by clouds, vegetation, or atmospheric particles. Moss uses this reduced light efficiently, maintaining photosynthesis without excess energy input. The absence of intense light limits stress and prevents overheating, keeping metabolic processes within narrow bounds. As environments change over decades, moss responds by adjusting activity rather than relocating. Where tree cover increases, light levels decrease and growth slows. Where cover thins, activity increases modestly if moisture remains available. These adjustments maintain presence without altering form or distribution dramatically. Moss also influences how surfaces respond to disturbance. When soil or rock is exposed, moss provides an early stabilizing presence. Its slow growth limits erosion and prepares the surface for later biological activity. This role unfolds without urgency, aligning with the pace of surface change. Across landscapes, similar patterns appear wherever moss persists. Activity aligns with moisture. Growth remains incremental. Accumulation reflects long-term conditions rather than short-term variation. These patterns repeat across regions, linking local processes to broader environmental systems. Through repeated cycles of exchange and renewal, moss maintains its role without interruption. It does not drive change directly, but it supports the conditions under which change unfolds gradually. Its influence becomes evident only when viewed across extended spans of time. In this steady manner, moss continues to integrate physical, chemical, and biological processes at the surface. It remains present as environments shift around it, maintaining continuity through duration rather than intensity. Moss remains part of systems where change is distributed across time rather than concentrated in events. Day to day, variation alters surface moisture and temperature. Seasonal cycles shift light availability and precipitation. Long-term trends influence vegetation patterns and hydrology. Moss responds at each scale through the same mechanisms, adjusting activity without altering form. The chemical processes within moss remain simple and repeatable. Water entering the tissue dissolves gases and ions, allowing exchange to occur through diffusion. Carbon fixed during photosynthesis becomes part of structural material or is released slowly through respiration. These reactions proceed at rates determined by immediate conditions, preventing imbalance or accumulation beyond the capacity of the system. Across extended periods, this restraint supports persistence. Moss does not require periods of recovery after unfavorable conditions. Instead, activity pauses and resumes as conditions allow. This continuity reduces stress and avoids damage that would require repair. The system remains intact through repeated cycles of activation and rest. In landscapes where moss cover is widespread, these properties influence broader patterns. Moisture retained at the surface supports gradual infiltration into soil. Temperature moderation reduces extremes experienced by ground-dwelling organisms. Nutrient availability remains localized, supporting stable biological communities. These effects combine without amplification, maintaining equilibrium rather than driving change. Moss also contributes to the gradual smoothing of surfaces. By retaining moisture and trapping fine material, it reduces sharp contrasts between exposed rock and developing soil. Over decades, this leads to more uniform surfaces that support additional biological activity. The transformation is subtle, but it continues as long as moss remains present. This role does not depend on dominance or expansion. Moss occupies space without displacing other organisms aggressively. It persists alongside them, maintaining its function while allowing surrounding systems to evolve. Its presence remains constant, even as composition and structure change around it. Through this steady participation, moss remains integrated within environmental processes that operate across multiple scales. It links immediate physical conditions to long-term outcomes through repetition and duration. The surfaces it occupies reflect this continuity, shaped gradually by the same interactions repeated over time. Moss function within environments where stability emerges from repetition. Each interaction between water, air, and surface material follows the same basic pattern. Moisture arrives, exchange occurs, and activity adjusts. When conditions shift, the pattern pauses rather than breaks, preserving continuity across cycles. This consistency allows moss to remain effective even when external factors vary. In years with higher rainfall, activity extends over longer periods. In drier years, activity becomes intermittent. The cumulative outcome remains similar because growth and accumulation are spread across many small intervals rather than concentrated in brief phases. The physical properties of moss contribute to this outcome. Flexible cell walls allow tissue to expand and contract without damage as water content changes. Structural components maintain integrity during drying, preventing collapse. These features support repeated transitions between active and inactive states without loss of function. Across landscapes, moss influences how surfaces respond to gradual environmental change. As climate patterns shift, the timing of moisture availability alters. Moss responds by adjusting periods of activity rather than relocating or changing form. Where conditions remain within tolerable ranges, presence is maintained. Where thresholds are crossed, activity slows, leaving the surface stable but less biologically active. In long-established systems, accumulated moss layers continue to interact with underlying material. Water retained near the surface influences chemical reactions within soil and rock. Nutrient movement remains local. Organic material continues to accumulate slowly. These processes persist, regardless of short-term variability. Moss also affects how surfaces recover from minor disturbance. When small areas are exposed, moisture retention and surface stability support gradual recolonization. This recovery does not involve rapid growth or expansion. It unfolds at the same pace as normal accumulation, reinforcing continuity. Through these repeated interactions, moss maintains its role without requiring adaptation through change. It remains present through variation, rather than responding to it. Its influence accumulates through duration, shaping surface conditions gradually over time. In this way, moss remains integrated within environmental systems that extend beyond its physical scale. It connects immediate conditions to long-term patterns through steady exchange and persistence. Moss remains at the boundary between living and non-living material. It grows where mineral surfaces meet air and water, occupying a zone where physical and biological processes overlap. This position allows it to influence how surfaces develop without becoming detached from the conditions that shape them. As water moves through moss, it carries dissolved gases and ions that participate in chemical exchange. Carbon dioxide enters during photosynthesis. Oxygen moves outward as a byproduct. Other dissolved substances move slowly between plant tissue and surrounding water. These exchanges occur continuously when moisture is present, maintaining equilibrium within the system. The slow pace of these processes limits variation. Moss does not accumulate excess resources, that would require later redistribution. Instead, input and output remain closely matched. This balance supports persistence across fluctuating conditions without the need for regulation or storage. Across time, the presence of moss contributes to the formation of surfaces that support additional biological activity. Soil develops gradually beneath persistent cover. Microbial communities stabilize. Invertebrates find consistent habitat. Larger plants benefit indirectly from moderated conditions. Each layer of interaction builds upon the last without accelerating change. Moss does not respond to these developments by increasing growth rate or altering form. It remains unchanged in structure, continuing to interact with water, light, and surface material in the same way. This consistency allows it to remain functional, even as surrounding systems become more complex. In areas where environmental change proceeds slowly, moss remains a constant reference point. It does not indicate progress or decline. It reflects continuity. Its presence marks places where surface conditions have remained within narrow limits for extended periods. Through repeated cycles of activity and rest, moss maintains its role across days, seasons, and centuries. Its influence emerges through accumulation rather than intensity. The systems it supports continue to evolve around it, shaped by the same gradual processes that define its own persistence. Moss operate within environments shaped by slow exchange rather than rapid transformation. At the surface, moisture availability governs the timing of activity. Below the surface, accumulated material influences chemical conditions and water movement. Above, atmospheric patterns determine how often favorable conditions return. Moss remains aligned with all three, responding without modification. The interaction between moss and water remains central. Capillary spaces between leaves and stems hold thin films of moisture that support gas exchange and nutrient movement. These films form and disappear repeatedly, allowing activity to rise and fall without structural change. This repeated adjustment maintains continuity across variable conditions. Energy use within moss remains modest. Photosynthesis proceeds at rates limited by light intensity and water availability. Sugars produce support maintenance and gradual growth rather than storage. Respiration releases carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere at similarly low rates. This balance prevents accumulation of excess material and supports long-term stability. Over decades, the persistence of moss contributes to surface uniformity. Rough textures become softened by retained moisture and trapped material. Chemical reactions proceed at consistent rates. Biological communities establish within predictable limits. These outcomes emerge without acceleration, reflecting the cumulative effect of repeated small interactions. Moss does not require isolation to persist. It grows alongside other organisms, occupying spaces that remain unsuitable for rapid growth. Its presence reduces extremes rather than excluding competitors. This coexistence supports diversity without conflict, allowing multiple systems to operate simultaneously. As environmental conditions shift gradually, moss remains responsive rather than reactive. It does not resist change directly. It adjusts activity within existing limits. Where conditions remain tolerable, presence continues. Where they do not, activity slows without causing disruption. Through this steady engagement with its surroundings, moss remains integrated within processes that extend across time. Its influence is distributed evenly, shaping surface conditions through repetition and duration. The landscapes it occupies reflect this continuity, marked by gradual change rather than visible transition. Moss remains connected to systems that operate beyond immediate visibility. Atmospheric moisture condenses and evaporates in response to temperature and airflow. Moss responds directly to these shifts, absorbing water when available and releasing it gradually. This exchange links local surface conditions to broader atmospheric patterns without delay or storage. The surface layers formed by moss continue to influence how materials move through the environment. Water entering the mat encounters resistance that slows its passage. Dissolved substances remain in contact with biological surfaces longer, allowing exchange to occur before movement continues. This moderation supports gradual chemical balance rather than rapid transport. Within the moss mat, physical structure remains open and flexible. Spaces between cells and stems adjust with changing water content. This flexibility prevents damage during drying and allows rapid rehydration. Structural integrity is maintained through repeated cycles, supporting persistence across variable conditions. Over long spans of time, these properties shape how landscapes respond to gradual change. Where moss cover is continuous, surfaces remain stable despite variation in weather. Soil formation proceeds evenly. Water movement remains predictable. These conditions support broader ecological processes that depend on consistency rather than speed. Moss does not alter its role as conditions evolve. It does not expand aggressively when resources increase, nor does it retreat rapidly when they decrease. It maintains presence within defined limits, allowing surrounding systems to adjust around it. This restraint contributes to long-term equilibrium. Across environments, the same interactions repeat. Water arrives and departs, light fluctuates, temperature varies, moss responds through direct exchange, maintaining continuity across cycles that differ in duration and intensity. The outcome remains stable because activity remains proportional to conditions. Through this steady interaction, moss continues to integrate physical and biological processes at the surface. Its influence accumulates through time rather than force. The systems it supports reflect this gradual shaping, marked by persistence and balance rather than visible change. Moss exists within a narrow band where physical conditions remain workable but never abundant. Light is sufficient but subdued. Water is present but intermittent. Nutrients arrive slowly and in small amounts. These limits shape every process, keeping activity aligned with what the environment can support. At the level of individual cells, this alignment is maintained through passive exchange. Water enters and leaves without resistance. Gases diffuse according to concentration gradients. Chemical reactions proceed only when conditions allow. There is no separation between internal and external states. Activity mirrors the immediate environment directly. This direct coupling reduces the risk of imbalance. Moss does not accumulate internal pressure to grow or expand. It does not store large reserves that would require redistribution. Each moment of activity is matched to the availability of resources, maintaining equilibrium across changing conditions. As moss persists, it continues to influence how surfaces behave over time. Moisture retained near the ground supports steady chemical interaction between water and mineral material. Fine particles become incorporated into developing layers. Organic matter accumulates slowly. These changes reinforce the conditions that allow moss to remain present. In regions where moss cover is extensive, its influence extends beyond the surface. Water retained within moss layers feeds into soil moisture below. Temperature moderation affects microbial activity deeper in the ground. Nutrient movement becomes more gradual and localized. These effects combine to support stable biological communities without rapid turnover. Moss does not respond to these outcomes by altering its behavior. It remains consistent in form and function. The surrounding system becomes more complex, but moss continues to operate at the same pace, maintaining its role within the evolving context. Across decades and centuries, this consistency becomes significant. Landscapes shaped by slow processes retain continuity through repeated cycles of change. Moss contributes to this continuity by remaining present where conditions allow, linking immediate exchanges to long-term development. Through steady interaction, rather than visible transformation, moss continues to shape the surfaces it occupies. Its influence emerges through duration and repetition, supporting systems that evolve gradually over time. Moss remains within systems where balance is maintained through limitation. Growth is constrained by light, water, and temperature, and these constraints prevent excess. Activity unfolds only when conditions allow, and when they do not, processes pause without damage. This restraint keeps the system aligned with its environment over long periods. As water moves through the moss layer, it interacts with organic and mineral material repeatedly. Each contact alters chemical composition slightly, contributing to gradual change rather than immediate transformation. Nutrients circulate locally, supporting microbial communities that remain stable through time. Losses occur slowly, matching gains, preserving equilibrium. The physical continuity of moss supports this balance. Mats remain intact through cycles of drying and rehydration. Flexible tissues adjust without fracture. Structural cohesion prevents fragmentation, allowing the system to persist even when conditions fluctuate. This durability reduces the need for recolonization or repair. Across landscapes, moss functions as a moderating presence. It softens the impact of variation rather than amplifying it. Where rainfall increases, water is absorbed and released gradually. Where temperatures rise, evaporation moderates heat. Where light intensifies, activity increases only within existing limits. Each response remains proportional. Over extended time spans, these proportional responses shape surface conditions. Soil develops steadily beneath persistent cover. Chemical gradients stabilize. Biological communities organize around predictable conditions. Moss remains at the center of these interactions without directing them. The persistence of moss does not depend on dominance or expansion. It remains present by maintaining alignment with the slowest processes in its environment. This alignment allows it to persist through changes that exceed individual lifespans and seasonal cycles. Through continued interaction with water, air, and surface material, moss maintains its role across time. Its influence accumulates quietly, shaping conditions through repetition rather than force. The environments it occupies reflect this gradual shaping, marked by continuity and balance. Moss function within environments where gradual processes dominate. Weather patterns shift, but not abruptly enough to disrupt continuity. Moisture availability changes, but remains within tolerable bounds. Light levels vary, yet remain sufficient for periodic activity. Moss remains aligned with these conditions, maintaining presence through adjustment rather than response. The chemical simplicity of moss supports this alignment. Exchange occurs through direct contact with water and air. There is no separation between transport and use. Substances move where gradients allow and stop when they do not. This simplicity reduces energy demand and limits the potential for imbalance. Across repeated cycles, this mode of operation creates predictability. Activity resumes when moisture returns. Growth proceeds incrementally. Accumulation continues at a steady rate. These patterns repeat across days, seasons, and years, producing outcomes that remain stable even as conditions vary. In environments where moss persists over long periods, its influence becomes integrated into surface structure. Materials held within the moss layer alter water movement and chemical exchange below. Soil develops gradually. Surface roughness decreases. These changes reinforce conditions that support continued moss presence, creating a feedback that remains balanced rather than accelerating. Moss does not alter this feedback actively. It does not increase growth rate in response to favorable conditions. It does not retreat rapidly during unfavorable ones. It maintains a steady relationship with its surroundings, allowing external factors to determine the pace of activity. As landscapes evolve, moss remains present through phases of change. Vegetation patterns shift. Hydrological pathways adjust. Climate trends unfold over decades. Moss persists through each phase, continuing to operate within the same physical limits. Through this persistence, moss contributes to continuity across environmental systems. It links immediate surface processes to long-term development through repetition and duration. Its influence is not concentrated in moments, but distributed evenly across time. Moss remains active within limits defined by its surroundings. It does not seek new conditions or alter its behavior in anticipation of change. Instead, it responds only to what is present, allowing activity to rise and fall in step with moisture, light, and temperature. This responsiveness without foresight maintains balance across repeated cycles. Within the moss layer, material exchange continues steadily. Water entering the system dissolves gases and nutrients, allowing them to move between cells and surrounding surfaces. When water leaves, movement slows, preserving internal structure until conditions allow activity to resume. This repeated pattern prevents depletion and avoids excess. Across long periods, the accumulation of moss influences how surfaces retain memory of past conditions. Layers reflect periods of greater or lesser activity through differences in density and composition. These variations remain subtle, forming a continuous record rather than distinct boundaries. The surface becomes shaped by history without visible interruption. The presence of moss also affects how biological communities organize. Microorganisms adapt to stable moisture and temperature regimes. Invertebrates occupy predictable spaces within the structure. Larger plants interact indirectly through changes in soil and surface conditions. These relationships persist because underlying processes remain consistent. Moss does not compete for dominance. It occupies niches defined by limitation rather than abundance. This allows coexistence with a wide range of organisms that rely on more variable or resource-rich conditions. The system remains layered rather than exclusive, supporting diversity through stability. As environmental conditions evolve slowly, moss maintains alignment with the slowest processes at work. It remains present through gradual shifts in climate, hydrology, and vegetation. Its form remains unchanged, even as context transforms around it. Through sustained interaction, rather than visible action, moss continues to shape the surfaces it occupies. Its influence accumulates through repetition and duration, linking immediate exchange to long-term development. Moss remains through gradual shifts that occur across extended spans of time. As climates adjust and vegetation patterns change, the conditions at the surface respond incrementally. Moisture arrives differently. Light reaches the ground in altered patterns. Temperatures fluctuate within new ranges. Moss adjusts activity without altering structure, maintaining continuity through these transitions. The interaction between moss and surface material continues uninterrupted. Water held within the moss layer influences chemical reactions at the boundary between organic and mineral matter. Dissolved substances move slowly, supporting gradual transformation rather than rapid exchange. These interactions contribute to steady development of surface layers that remain stable over long periods. Energy flow within moss remains modest and controlled. Photosynthesis proceeds only when light and moisture coincide. Sugars produced support maintenance and gradual growth. Respiration releases energy at similarly low rates. This balance prevents excess accumulation and supports persistence without expansion. Across landscapes, moss maintains similar functions regardless of context. Whether present on forest floors, stone surfaces, or open ground, it interacts with water, light, and air in the same way. The surrounding environment determines frequency and duration of activity, but not the nature of the processes themselves. As years pass, the cumulative effects of these interactions become apparent. Surfaces remain stable. Moisture retention supports continued biological activity. Chemical gradients develop slowly and persist. Moss contributes to these outcomes through steady participation rather than directional change. Moss does not signal transition points or milestones. It remains present before, during, and after gradual shifts in environmental conditions. Its influence emerges through continuity, providing a stable framework within which other systems evolve. Through repeated cycles of exchange and rest, moss continues to integrate physical and biological processes at the surface. Its role remains defined by duration rather than intensity, shaping environments quietly over time. Moss remains active within environments where change unfolds slowly enough to allow continuity. As moisture patterns adjust over seasons and years, the timing of activity shifts without disrupting structure. Light reaches the surface differently as surrounding vegetation changes, yet moss continues to operate whenever conditions allow. This alignment with gradual change supports persistence across long spans of time. Within the moss layer, physical and chemical processes remain closely linked. Water arriving at the surface dissolves gases and minerals, allowing exchange to occur through direct contact. As water moves or evaporates, movement slows rather than stops abruptly. This gradual modulation prevents sudden shifts in internal conditions, maintaining stability within the system. The structure of moss supports this modulation. Cells remain flexible, adjusting volume as water content changes. Connections between cells maintain cohesion, preventing fragmentation during drying. When moisture returns, the same pathways support rapid reactivation without repair. This repeated transition between states occurs without cumulative damage. Across extended periods, moss contributes to the development of surfaces that resist rapid change. Moisture retention reduces erosion. Chemical exchange proceeds steadily. Organic material accumulates slowly. These processes reinforce each other, creating conditions that remain favorable for continued presence without requiring adaptation through change. Moss does not alter its role as these conditions develop. It does not increase growth rate in response to improved stability. It remains aligned with the slowest processes in the system, allowing outcomes to emerge through repetition rather than acceleration. As landscapes evolve, moss continues to occupy the boundary between air, water, and solid material. It links immediate surface conditions to long-term development through steady interaction. Its influence remains subtle, becoming apparent only when viewed across extended spans of time. Through this persistence, moss maintains continuity within environments shaped by gradual change. Its role remains defined by duration and consistency, supporting systems that evolve quietly around it. Moss operate within systems where balance is maintained through slow exchange. Water arrives at the surface in varied forms, as rain, mist, or condensation. Each source contributes to moisture availability without overwhelming the system. Moss absorbs what is present, holds it briefly, and releases it gradually, keeping conditions within narrow bounds. The chemical environment within the moss layer remains shaped by this moderation. Acids released during normal metabolic activity influence mineral surfaces gently. Nutrients become available through gradual breakdown rather than sudden release. Microbial processes remain steady, supported by consistent moisture and temperature. These interactions maintain equilibrium across repeated cycles. As time extends, the accumulated presence of moss affects how surfaces respond to broader environmental trends. Where rainfall increases gradually, retained moisture extends periods of activity. Where temperatures rise slowly, evaporation moderates extremes. Moss adjusts activity accordingly, without altering its structure or distribution abruptly. The persistence of moss also influences how biological communities adapt to long-term change. Organisms that depend on stable surface conditions find continuity within moss-dominated areas. Processes that require consistency rather than abundance remain supported. This stability allows gradual adjustment rather than rapid reorganization. Moss does not initiate or direct these changes. It remains present as conditions evolve, interacting with water, light, and air in the same way across time. Its influence arises from continuous participation rather than intervention. Across landscapes, this pattern repeats. Moss persists through variation by maintaining alignment with environmental limits. Its form remains familiar. Its function remains consistent. Only the context shifts gradually around it. Through sustained interaction over long periods, moss continues to shape surface conditions quietly. Its role is defined by repetition and duration, contributing to continuity within systems that change slowly. Moss remains as conditions shift gradually across years and decades. Rainfall patterns change in frequency rather than intensity. Periods of dryness lengthen or shorten without eliminating moisture entirely. Moss responds by adjusting how often activity resumes, maintaining continuity without altering form. Within the moss layer, movement remains governed by diffusion and capillary action. Water enters narrow spaces between cells, carrying dissolved gases and nutrients. As moisture decreases, these pathways contract rather than close, slowing exchange without interrupting structure. This behavior prevents abrupt change and preserves internal balance. Energy use continues at a restrained pace. Photosynthesis occurs only when light and moisture coincide. Sugars produced support cellular maintenance and slow growth. Respiration releases energy steadily, preventing accumulation beyond what the system can support. This balance keeps activity aligned with immediate conditions rather than stored potential. Over long spans of time, the accumulation of moss influences how surfaces develop resilience. Moisture retained near the ground reduces variability in soil conditions. Chemical exchange proceeds evenly. Organic material builds slowly. These effects support stability across environments that might otherwise experience sharper fluctuations. Moss does not expand to occupy new conditions aggressively. It remains within zones where moisture, light, and temperature overlap sufficiently. Where these zones shift gradually, moss remains present. Where they shift beyond limits, activity slows without disrupting surface stability. As surrounding systems evolve, moss continues to operate within the same constraints. Vegetation changes alter light patterns. Hydrological systems adjust flow paths. Climate trends influence seasonal timing. Moss responds by adjusting activity, maintaining continuity through gradual change. Through repeated cycles of exchange and rest, moss continues to integrate physical and biological processes at the surface. Its influence remains subtle, emerging through duration rather than intensity. The environments it occupies reflect this steady shaping, marked by persistence across time. Moss remains within environments where gradual adjustment allows continuity. As surface conditions evolve, the timing of moisture and light availability shifts without removing either entirely. Moss responds by adjusting activity windows rather than altering form, maintaining alignment with conditions that remain workable. Water movement through the moss layer continues to regulate exchange. Thin films form and retreat in response to humidity and rainfall. These films allow gases and dissolved substances to move freely when present, then slow exchange when absent. This rhythm maintains balance across repeated cycles without disruption. Chemical processes within moss remain constrained by this rhythm. Photosynthesis proceeds when moisture allows, fixing carbon into structural material. Respiration releases energy steadily, preventing accumulation beyond immediate need. Nutrient movement follows similar patterns, remaining local and gradual rather than episodic. Across extended periods, the accumulation of moss influences how surfaces retain stability. Moisture moderated at the surface reduces variability below. Chemical reactions proceed evenly. Organic material builds slowly. These effects reinforce each other, supporting persistence without accelerating change. Moss does not respond to improved stability by increasing growth rate. It remains aligned with environmental limits, allowing surrounding systems to adjust at their own pace. Where conditions remain suitable, presence continues. Where conditions shift beyond tolerance, activity slows without destabilizing the surface. As landscapes change over decades, moss continues to operate within the same physical constraints. Vegetation alters light patterns. Hydrology adjusts moisture distribution. Climate trends influence seasonal timing. Moss responds through activity modulation, preserving continuity through gradual change. Through steady interaction with water, light, and surface material, moss maintains its role across time. Its influence accumulates quietly through repetition and duration, shaping environments that evolve slowly around it. Continuing now with an increased block length. Moss remains integrated within environments where long-term processes shape outcomes more than short-term variation. As rainfall patterns shift gradually, the timing of moisture availability changes without eliminating it. Moss responds by extending or shortening periods of activity, maintaining continuity without altering its structure or position. Water continues to govern internal movement. Thin films form along leaf surfaces and between stems, creating pathways for gas exchange and nutrient movement. These films appear and recede repeatedly, allowing activity to track environmental conditions closely. When moisture is absent, internal processes slow rather than stop, preserving structure until exchange can resume. Energy flow within moss remains tightly regulated by this dependence on water and light. Photosynthesis proceeds only during overlapping availability, fixing carbon at a measured pace. Sugars produce support, cellular maintenance, and incremental growth. Respiration releases energy steadily, preventing accumulation that would exceed environmental capacity. Over decades, this balance influences surface development. Moisture retained within moss layers moderates conditions beneath, reducing extremes in temperature and water availability. Chemical reactions proceed evenly at the boundary between organic and mineral material. Organic matter accumulates slowly, forming stable layers that reflect long-term conditions rather than seasonal variation. Moss does not alter its behavior as these conditions develop. It does not increase growth rate in response to improved stability. It remains aligned with the slowest processes in the system, allowing outcomes to emerge gradually through repetition rather than acceleration. As surrounding vegetation changes, light reaching the surface adjusts incrementally. Moss responds by modulating activity rather than relocating or changing form. Where light decreases, growth slows. Where light increases and moisture remains available, activity increases modestly. These responses preserve presence without disruption. Across landscapes, moss continues to occupy the interface between air, water, and solid surface. It links immediate environmental conditions to long-term surface development through steady interaction. Its influence accumulates quietly over time, shaping environments that evolve slowly around it. Moss persists within systems shaped by long periods of gradual adjustment. Environmental inputs arrive unevenly, but not abruptly enough to disrupt continuity. Moisture varies from day to day, yet remains within a range that allows repeated activation. Light shifts with cloud cover, canopy growth, and seasonal change, but continues to reach the surface indirectly. Moss remains aligned with these conditions through activity modulation rather than structural change. Within the moss layer, physical exchange remains consistent. Water enters through surface contact, dissolving gases and ions that move freely through thin tissues. As moisture declines, diffusion slows without causing damage. Cellular structures remain intact, allowing rapid resumption of activity when conditions permit. This repeated transition maintains internal balance without requiring recovery or repair. Chemical processes continue at restrained rates. Carbon fixation occurs only during brief overlapping windows of light and moisture. Sugars produced are incorporated into structure or used for maintenance rather than storage. Respiration releases energy steadily, matching production and preventing accumulation beyond immediate need. This balance keeps the system aligned with environmental limits. Over extended spans of time, Moss contributes to the development of surfaces that favor continuity. Moisture retention reduces variability in conditions below the surface. Chemical exchange proceeds evenly at boundaries between organic and mineral material. Organic matter accumulates slowly, forming stable layers that reflect long-term patterns rather than short-term fluctuation. Moss does not amplify these effects. It does not expand rapidly when conditions improve, nor does it retreat sharply when they decline. It remains present within zones where moisture, light, and temperature overlap sufficiently. As these zones shift gradually, moss remains aligned with them. Across changing landscapes, this persistence allows moss to function as a steady component within evolving systems. Vegetation patterns alter light distribution. Hydrological pathways adjust slowly. Climate trends influence seasonal timing. Moss responds through activity adjustment, preserving continuity across these transitions. Through sustained interaction with water, air, and surface material, moss continues to integrate physical and biological processes at the surface. Its influence accumulates through duration and repetition, shaping environments quietly as they evolve over time. Moss remains as systems approach longer-term equilibrium. Surfaces shaped by repeated interaction become increasingly stable. Moisture moves predictably. Chemical conditions change slowly. Biological activity remains distributed evenly rather than concentrated in brief phases. Moss operate within these conditions without modification. The exchange between moss and water persists as the primary driver of activity. Thin layers of moisture allow diffusion of gases and dissolved substances whenever conditions permit. As moisture recedes, exchange slows without disruption. This responsiveness maintains balance across repeated cycles, preventing extremes in internal conditions. Energy use remains closely matched to availability. Photosynthesis occurs during brief overlapping periods of light and moisture. Carbon fixed during these periods supports maintenance and incremental growth. Respiration releases energy steadily, maintaining equilibrium. No surplus accumulates, and no deficit develops. The system remains aligned with its environment. Over decades, the accumulation of moss influences how surfaces retain continuity. Organic layers deepen slowly. Chemical gradients stabilize. Moisture retention supports consistent conditions below the surface. These effects reinforce each other, maintaining environments that change gradually rather than abruptly. Moss does not direct this process. It participates through sustained interaction rather than control. Where surrounding vegetation alters light availability, moss adjusts activity accordingly. Where hydrological patterns shift slowly, moisture availability changes without eliminating presence. This flexibility supports persistence across evolving conditions. As broader systems develop, moss remains integrated within them. It occupies the same interface between air, water, and solid material, maintaining continuity through repeated exchange. Its role does not expand or contract dramatically. It remains constant while context evolves. Through this steady presence, moss continues to shape surface conditions quietly. Its influence accumulates through repetition and duration, contributing to environments that remain stable, even as larger patterns unfold over time. Moss exists within systems that have settled into slow, repeating patterns. Once surfaces reach a certain level of stability, changes become incremental rather than directional. Moisture remains available in familiar cycles. Light reaches the ground in predictable intervals. Temperature shifts remain within ranges that do not interrupt continuity. Moss remains aligned with these patterns, maintaining activity without alteration. Within the moss layer, material exchange continues to follow the same pathways. Water enters through surface contact, allowing gases and nutrients to diffuse through thin tissues. As water leaves, movement slows, but structure remains intact. This repeated adjustment preserves balance without requiring internal regulation or storage. The chemical environment remains shaped by restraint. Acids produced during metabolism interact gently with surrounding material. Nutrients circulate locally, supporting microorganisms that operate within the same limits. Decomposition proceeds slowly, matching production rather than exceeding it. These conditions maintain equilibrium across long periods. Over extended spans of time, moss contributes to surface conditions that resist abrupt change. Moisture retention buffers variation. Organic accumulation deepens gradually. Chemical gradients stabilize. These outcomes reinforce the conditions that support continued presence without accelerating transformation. Moss does not respond to this stability by expanding or intensifying activity. It remains present within the same boundaries, allowing surrounding systems to evolve at their own pace. Where vegetation changes slowly, moss adjusts activity accordingly. Where hydrological patterns shift gradually, moisture availability changes without disrupting structure. As landscapes continue to develop, moss remains integrated within them. It occupies the same interface between physical and biological processes, linking immediate conditions to long-term outcomes through steady interaction. Its role remains consistent even as context evolves. Through continued exchange with water, air, and surface material, moss maintains its presence across time. Its influence accumulates through repetition and duration, shaping environments quietly as larger systems unfold around it. Moss remains as systems move further into long-term stability. At this stage, changes are governed less by individual events and more by accumulated patterns. Moisture arrives in familiar cycles. Light reaches the surface through established pathways. Temperature variation follows predictable ranges. Moss aligns its activity with these conditions without modification. Within the moss layer, exchange remains continuous but restrained. Water enters through contact with air and surface material, carrying dissolved gases and nutrients. These substances move through tissues by diffusion, responding directly to availability. When moisture declines, movement slows without interrupting structure. This repeated modulation preserves internal balance across time. Energy flow remains modest and controlled. Photosynthesis occurs during overlapping windows of light and moisture, fixing carbon at a measured pace. The resulting sugars support maintenance and incremental growth rather than accumulation. Respiration releases energy steadily, preventing imbalance between input and output. The system remains aligned with environmental limits. As organic material accumulates beneath living growth, chemical conditions stabilize. Oxygen availability decreases gradually with depth, slowing decomposition. Nutrients remain bound within developing layers rather than being lost. This gradual accumulation reflects long-term conditions rather than short-term variation, preserving continuity across decades. Moss does not alter its behavior in response to these developments. It remains present without expanding into new conditions or retreating from existing ones. Activity adjusts within established limits, allowing surrounding systems to evolve without disruption. Across landscapes, this persistence supports environments that resist abrupt change. Moisture retention moderates extremes. Chemical exchange proceeds evenly. Biological communities remain organized around stable conditions. Moss remains integrated within these systems, maintaining its role through steady interaction. Through continued exchange with water, air, and surface material, moss sustains its presence across time. Its influence accumulates through repetition and duration, shaping environments quietly as broader systems continue to unfold. Moss operate within systems that have settled into familiar rhythms. At this stage, variation is subtle and evenly distributed. Moisture arrives and recedes in repeating patterns. Light reaches the surface through established openings. Temperature changes follow gradual seasonal movement. Moss responds through small adjustments in activity, maintaining continuity without structural change. Within the moss layer, physical exchange remains consistent. Thin films of water form along surfaces, allowing gases and dissolved substances to move freely. As these films withdraw, diffusion slows without damaging tissue. Cellular structures remain intact, preserving the ability to resume activity whenever conditions allow. This repeated transition supports persistence without recovery or repair. Chemical processes remain balanced. Carbon fixed during photosynthesis supports maintenance and slow growth. Respiration releases energy at a similar pace. Nutrients circulate locally, influenced by moisture retention and microbial activity. Loss and gain remain closely matched, preventing accumulation or depletion beyond environmental capacity. Over long periods, the continued presence of moss shapes surface conditions that favor stability. Organic layers deepen gradually. Moisture retention moderates variability below the surface. Chemical gradients develop slowly and persist. These outcomes reinforce the conditions that allow moss to remain present, creating continuity without acceleration. Moss does not alter its behavior as these conditions stabilize. It does not expand aggressively into new spaces. It does not retreat from established ones. Activity remains aligned with immediate conditions, allowing surrounding systems to adjust at their own pace. As broader environmental patterns continue to evolve, moss remains integrated within them. Vegetation shifts alter light distribution gradually. Hydrological pathways adjust slowly. Climate trends influence timing rather than structure. Moss responds by modulating activity, preserving presence across these changes. Through steady interaction with water, air, and surface material, moss continues to link immediate conditions to long-term outcomes. Its influence remains subtle, accumulating through repetition and duration as environments evolve quietly around it. Moss function, in places where surface conditions have become relatively stable over long periods of time. Water follows familiar routes across the ground, moving slowly through shaded soil, decaying wood, or porous stone. Light reaches the surface in regular intervals, filtered by vegetation or cloud cover. Temperature varies seasonally, but remains within ranges that do not interrupt basic cellular processes. Moss remains active within these constraints, responding directly to what is available rather than changing its structure. Within the moss layer, water movement governs nearly all internal activity. When moisture is present, it spreads through narrow spaces between leaves and stems by capillary action. Dissolved gases and minerals move with this water, allowing photosynthesis and respiration to proceed. As moisture declines, these pathways narrow and movement slows. Cellular structures remain intact, allowing activity to pause without damage and resume quickly when water returns. Energy capture remains closely tied to these moisture cycles. Photosynthesis occurs only during periods when both light and water are available at the same time. Carbon fixed during these periods is incorporated into cell walls and supporting tissue, contributing to slow outward growth. Respiration releases energy at a similar pace, preventing accumulation beyond what the environment can sustain. This balance keeps growth gradual and continuous rather than episodic. Beneath the living surface, older moss tissue becomes compacted and chemically altered. Oxygen availability decreases with depth as water fills pore spaces. This slows microbial decomposition and allows organic material to persist. Nutrients released from this material remain close to the surface, available for reuse rather than being rapidly transported away. Over time, this process contributes to stable surface layers that reflect long-term moisture and temperature conditions. Moss does not respond to these developments by increasing growth rate or spreading into new areas. It remains confined to surfaces where moisture, light, and temperature overlap consistently. Where these conditions persist, moss remains active. Where they shift beyond tolerance, activity slows without destabilizing the surface. Across landscapes, this behavior supports environments that change gradually rather than abruptly. Moisture retention reduces variability in soil conditions. Chemical exchange proceeds at steady rates. Organisms living within and beneath the moss experience relatively stable conditions over time. Moss remains integrated within these systems through continuous interaction rather than intervention. Moss function at the scale of immediate physical processes. Water arriving at the surface spreads across leaves and stems, forming thin films that allow gas exchange and chemical movement. When these films are present, carbon dioxide enters cells and oxygen diffuses outward. Dissolved minerals move with the water, supplying small amounts of nutrients that support maintenance and slow growth. When the films disappear, movement slows and activity pauses without structural damage. The structure of moss makes this possible. Leaves are thin, often only a single cell thick, which shortens the distance that gases and light must travel. There is no separation between transport tissue and photosynthetic tissue. Every exposed surface participates in exchange. This allows moss to respond quickly to changes in moisture without relying on stored reserves or internal regulation. Temperature influences the speed of these reactions rather than their occurrence. As temperatures rise within a moderate range, enzymatic reactions proceed more quickly. As temperatures fall, reaction rates slow. Because moss does not depend on continuous activity, these changes do not interrupt function. Activity adjusts smoothly, tracking ambient conditions rather than resisting them. Over time, repeated cycles of hydration and drying shape the material beneath the living surface. Older tissue becomes compressed, altering its physical structure. Water movement through these layers slows further, extending contact time between moisture and organic material. Chemical reactions proceed gradually, changing acidity and nutrient availability in ways that remain consistent across years rather than fluctuating with individual events. These changes influence organisms that live alongside moss. Microorganisms benefit from stable moisture and temperature conditions within the moss mat. Small invertebrates move through interconnected spaces, feeding on microbes and organic debris. Their activity redistributes nutrients locally, contributing to slow but continuous cycling. Moss remains within this system without altering its behavior. It does not increase growth rate in response to favorable conditions, nor does it retreat rapidly when conditions become less suitable. Activity remains proportional to immediate inputs of water and light. Structure remains unchanged. Across landscapes, this behavior produces similar outcomes wherever moss persists. Surfaces retain moisture longer. Temperature variation near the ground is reduced. Chemical exchange proceeds evenly. These effects accumulate over time, shaping surface conditions through repetition rather than force. Moss influences surface conditions through its effect on water retention and movement. When rainfall reaches a moss-covered surface, a portion of that water is held within the plant structure rather than passing immediately into soil or running off. This delays drainage and spreads moisture over a longer period of time. As a result, the surface remains damp even after rainfall has ended, extending the window during which biological activity can occur. This retained moisture alters how heat moves through the surface. Water held within the moss absorbs and releases heat more slowly than dry mineral material. During warmer periods, evaporation removes heat from the surface. During cooler periods, retained water reduces rapid cooling. These effects narrow temperature variation near the ground, creating more consistent conditions for organisms that operate within small thermal ranges. Chemical exchange also becomes more even under these conditions. Dissolved gases and nutrients move slowly through retained moisture, allowing reactions to proceed gradually rather than in short pulses. Carbon dioxide exchange remains steady during active periods. Nutrients released from organic material remain nearby, supporting continued microbial activity without rapid loss. Over repeated cycles, these processes contribute to surface stability. Fine particles become incorporated into developing layers. Organic material accumulates incrementally. Water pathways become established and predictable. Moss remains within these developing structures, continuing to interact with them in the same manner. The response of moss to variation remains proportional. When moisture availability increases, activity extends slightly. When it decreases, activity contracts. These adjustments occur without changes to structure or distribution. Moss does not store excess energy or materials. Each period of activity is closely matched to environmental supply. As surrounding systems continue to evolve, moss maintains its role at the surface interface. Vegetation growth alters light availability gradually. Soil depth increases slowly beneath persistent cover. Hydrological patterns adjust over long spans. Moss responds through activity modulation, preserving continuity across these changes. Through sustained interaction with water, air, and surface material, moss continues to shape environments at a pace defined by repetition rather than intensity. Its influence emerges through cumulative effect, supporting systems that change slowly over time. Moss affect how surfaces respond to minor disturbance. When small areas of soil or stone are exposed, retained moisture and physical stability limit immediate erosion. Water spreads laterally through the moss layer rather than concentrating into channels. This reduces the movement of loose material and allows surface conditions to remain relatively intact. Fragments of moss tissue can also contribute to re-establishment. Small pieces displaced by animals or water may settle nearby and resume activity when moisture is present. Because growth is slow, recovery unfolds gradually, but stability is maintained throughout the process. The surface does not return to a bare state before biological activity resumes. This behavior influences how landscapes recover from repeated low-level disturbance. Foot traffic, falling debris, and seasonal movement affect the surface without causing large-scale disruption. Moss absorbs these effects by distributing pressure and retaining moisture, preventing rapid change. Over time, the same areas continue to support activity despite ongoing interaction. Chemical conditions within the moss layer remain stable during these periods. Water retention preserves diffusion pathways. Nutrient movement remains local. Microbial communities continue to operate within narrow limits. These conditions support continuity even as physical contact occurs at the surface. Moss does not respond to disturbance by accelerating growth or altering structure. It remains aligned with available resources, allowing recovery to proceed at the same pace as normal accumulation. This consistency prevents overshoot and maintains balance across repeated cycles. Across landscapes, this pattern supports surfaces that remain functional over long periods. Areas where moss persists show reduced variability in moisture, temperature, and chemical conditions. These properties contribute to gradual rather than abrupt change, allowing systems to evolve without disruption. Through steady interaction with water, air, and surface material, moss continues to support stability at the interface between physical and biological processes. Its influence remains subtle, emerging through repetition and duration rather than visible transformation. Moss influence how surfaces age over time. By retaining moisture against mineral material, it supports slow chemical reactions that alter surface composition. Water held within the moss layer dissolves small amounts of minerals, allowing ions to move and react gradually. These reactions proceed over long periods, contributing to the transformation of hard surfaces into more biologically active material. This slow alteration affects how water continues to move. As surfaces become more porous, moisture is absorbed more evenly rather than pooling or running off quickly. Moss remains within these developing conditions, interacting with them in the same way as before. The relationship between surface structure and water movement becomes increasingly stable. Biological activity responds to this stability. Microorganisms occupy consistent niches where moisture and temperature remain predictable. Their metabolic processes proceed at steady rates, supporting gradual nutrient cycling. Moss does not regulate these interactions directly, but it maintains the conditions under which they persist. Over long spans of time, this combination of physical and biological processes shapes surface environments that change slowly. There are no sharp transitions. Instead, each cycle of moisture and drying adds a small increment to existing structure. Moss remains throughout, maintaining continuity across these changes. The persistence of moss does not depend on isolation from disturbance or variation. It continues to function alongside animals, plants, and environmental processes that interact with the surface regularly. Its structure absorbs and distributes these interactions, preventing rapid alteration. As systems approach long-term balance, moss remains integrated within them. It does not signal an endpoint or completion. It continues to operate through the same exchanges of water, air, and material that have shaped its role from the beginning. Through repeated interaction rather than visible change, moss maintains its influence across time. Its presence supports environments that evolve gradually, shaped by accumulation and restraint rather than acceleration. Moss occupy the surface as surrounding systems settle into patterns that repeat over long periods. Water movement becomes predictable, following established pathways through soil, stone, and organic layers. Moisture reaches the moss regularly enough to sustain activity, but rarely in excess. This balance supports continued exchange without forcing change. Within the moss layer, physical structure remains open and resilient. Spaces between leaves and stems adjust as water content changes, allowing repeated cycles of hydration and drying without loss of integrity. These spaces maintain diffusion pathways for gases and dissolved substances whenever moisture is present. Activity resumes smoothly because the underlying structure remains unchanged. Chemical processes continue at rates determined by immediate conditions. Carbon dioxide enters cells during active periods and is incorporated into structural material. Oxygen produced during photosynthesis diffuses outward. Nutrients move locally through retained water, supporting microbial activity that proceeds steadily rather than episodically. Loss and gain remain closely matched. As organic material accumulates beneath living growth, the surface becomes increasingly buffered against rapid change. Moisture retention moderates variability. Temperature extremes near the ground are reduced. Chemical reactions proceed evenly. These effects reinforce one another, maintaining conditions that support persistence without acceleration. Moss does not respond to this stability by expanding beyond its established range. It remains confined to surfaces where moisture, light, and temperature overlap consistently. Where these conditions persist, activity continues. Where they change gradually, activity adjusts without disrupting structure. Across landscapes, this behavior produces environments that remain functional across long spans of time. Surfaces retain moisture. Nutrient movement remains local. Biological communities remain organized around predictable conditions. Moss operate at the interface between physical and biological processes, maintaining continuity through steady interaction. Through repetition rather than transformation, moss sustains its role within systems shaped by slow exchange. Its influence accumulates quietly, supporting environments that evolve gradually rather than abruptly. Moss operate within surface systems that have become shaped by repetition. At this stage, most change occurs through refinement rather than development. Water moves through established routes. Moisture reaches the surface in familiar patterns. Light arrives with predictable timing. Moss remains active whenever these conditions align, maintaining the same mode of exchange that has supported its presence over long periods. Within the moss layer, diffusion remains the dominant process. Water entering the structure dissolves gases and minerals, allowing them to move freely through thin tissues. As moisture recedes, these movements slow without stopping abruptly. Cellular structures remain intact, preserving the capacity for activity to resume without delay. This repeated modulation maintains balance without requiring internal control. Energy use continues to match availability. Photosynthesis proceeds only during overlapping periods of light and moisture. Carbon fixed during these periods becomes part of structural tissue, supporting gradual outward growth. Respiration releases energy steadily, preventing accumulation beyond immediate need. The system remains closely coupled to environmental supply rather than internal demand. Beneath the living surface, accumulated material continues to influence conditions. Water movement slows further with depth. Oxygen availability decreases gradually. Chemical reactions proceed at restrained rates. These conditions preserve organic material and support microbial communities that operate within narrow limits. Nutrient movement remains local, reinforcing stability rather than variability. Moss does not alter its behavior as these conditions persist. It does not increase growth rate or expand into new areas. It remains present where moisture, light, and temperature overlap reliably. Where these factors shift gradually, activity adjusts without structural change. Where they fall outside tolerable ranges, activity slows while the surface remains stable. Across landscapes, this consistency supports environments that resist abrupt change. Surfaces retain moisture. Temperature variation near the ground is reduced. Chemical exchange remains even. Moss function at the interface between air, water, and solid material, linking immediate conditions to long-term surface development. Through sustained interaction rather than visible transformation, moss maintains its role across time. Its influence accumulates through repetition and duration, shaping environments quietly as broader systems continue to evolve. Thank you for listening to the Sleepy Mind channel. I hope you have enjoyed spending time moving through the moss.